In this sixth segment of reviews for microeconomics, we're going to discuss monopoly and how and why monopoly is different than perfect competition. So we have two graphs here to discuss monopoly. On the left-hand side, we're going to call this one the firm. This is a perfectly competitive firm. And over here, this will be the monopolist. The difference, we recall, for these two markets is that here there is entry and exit, no barriers to entry. No barriers to entry. Firms can enter, firms can exit. Consequently, the supply curve will shift. In this situation, for monopolists, there are barriers to entry. It's important for you to go and to look at the book to review what can be those barriers to entry. Sometimes that's a multiple choice type of question. You know, what sorts of things might be or not be a barrier to entry. In this case, we have barriers to entry, so firms can't enter. And when they can't enter, it means that only one firm is going to be operating in this market. It has the entire market, and its demand curve, unlike this is the market for perfect competition. But a firm, perfect competitive firm, will have a horizontal demand curve and will be able to sell as many units of its product as it wishes and can produce, all at that same prevailing P-star equilibrium price. The difference is that for a monopolist, to sell an additional unit, the only way the monopolist can induce or compel or encourage consumers to buy more units is to lower the price, because the monopolist is facing the demand curve for the entire industry, and it only can go out in quantity if it goes down in price on that demand curve. So equilibrium here is simple, straightforward. For the market, you have equilibrium of a Q star and a P star, and that P star horizontal line would be the demand curve for the firm. For monopolists, though, we said that, well, it has to lower the price for each additional unit it wants to sell. If it wants to sell additional units, it must lower the price actually on all units. Consequently, the marginal revenue for a monopolist has to be what? The price of the new unit, imagine that's one unit, minus the change in price on all the other units that it had been selling. Consequently, the marginal revenue will be the price minus some other value, price minus something, which means that marginal revenue must be less than price. It's important. This is nothing that you have to demonstrate on the exam. What you do need to demonstrate is the understanding that marginal revenue is less than price. If it's less than price, the marginal revenue curve will be underneath the demand curve. So let's just draw one a little bit arbitrarily. And now we're ready. This is marginal revenue. To determine what the firm will do, any firm will do, we have to follow the solution steps. So solution steps, write them down, take them away. Solution number one, the decision of how much production should this firm do? How much? It's a marginal question. A marginal question is going to be answered by looking at marginal values. So we have to know marginal values. In this case, it will produce any firm, perfectly competitive, monopolistically competitive, or a monopolist itself, will produce to the point where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the best you can do. You need to know why and be able to explain that on the exam. Number two, we need to remind ourselves that profits are defined as the average revenue minus average cost times the quantity. And we want to determine exactly what those profits are graphically. So we need then to evaluate that at this, in this case, Q sub m, the quantity, the optimal quantity that will be produced for this monopolist. So this, in step number one, will identify and obtain this Q sub m optimal quantity. Number two is just a statement of what profits are. Number three, we need to find out where AR and AC exactly intersect or are on this vertical line for Q sub m. So let's go ahead and look at Q sub m. In this situation here, and this is quantity on this axis, quantity here, this is price. Label your graphs carefully, explicitly. We have marginal cost equals supply. We know that marginal cost curves are supply curves. So this firm will do the best it can where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. And that'll be this Q sub M. Do not draw any lines horizontal at that point. If you do that, you're in peril of confusing yourself. Students who do that sometimes will grasp that in the context of an exam and think maybe that tells us price, or maybe it tells them something else, and it really doesn't tell us anything more except that's where marginal revenue and marginal cost are the same, and that's the best the firm can do because it's making all those units for which marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. Great stuff. Now we have to identify these values at Q sub M. So we extend this Q sub M upwards here, and that gives us the price. And that's the price of the market. So the first thing we do is try to evaluate what would have been the output quantity if this were a competitive firm. Output quantity would have been this intersection here, similar to that, with a quantity out here. It's quantity in perfect competition. So we can observe that first thing happens is quantity is less a monopoly. And the second thing is, well, this would have been the price in a perfectly competitive market. And the price then goes up. So that we see in monopolies, there'll be less manufactured at a higher price. What else do we know? Well, without worrying about the profits of this firm, let's just investigate one or two other things. First thing is, what about consumer and producer surplus? Back over here. Producer and consumer surplus, very simple to see. It's the difference between the willingness to pay and what's actually paid gives us consumer surplus. And the difference between what the firm requires to manufacture the quantity and the price received is then the producer surplus. They spilled over the edge there, sorry. On this side, well, we could see before that this was going to be consumer surplus, this would be producer surplus, but now that's the prevailing price. If that's the prevailing price, then the difference between the demand curve and the price paid shrinks from this large area to that smaller area. And the producer surplus, which would have been this area here, changes. First, because we don't go beyond Q sub M. There's no incentive for this company to go beyond Q sub M because at this point, marginal cost would be greater than marginal revenue. The firm would lose money on every unit that's to the right of that point. So it won't make those units. Instead, we're confined to this number of units, Q sub M. And the price went up. So now we have the price received minus the amount of money required to produce that amount. And so this firm now has a producer surplus that looks like that. So what's happened? What's happened is, well, part of this consumer surplus, what had been consumer surplus, has been transferred from consumers to producers. Besides that, so the consumer surplus shrinks, the producer surplus includes some that is transferred from the consumers, and then there's this wedge. There's a wedge out here, which was part of consumer and producer surplus when we manufactured the greater quantity that would have been manufactured and sold, obtained in a perfectly competitive market. It's not being produced any longer, so this whole wedge becomes the dead weight loss. In summation, monopolies result in lower quantity, higher price, and dead weight losses. We're going to stop this segment here and come back with one other segment which talks about the profits of a monopolist and what we could do if the government were to consider some type of regulation to restore some aspects of perfect competition.